Hey guys, Depression here. Today we're going to go over Patrick, the lead game designer's opinions on MMR and how I think they are very misguided, and they sort of indicate that he does not really understand what makes a good player in Dead by Daylight, and he kind of just looks way too black and white at things. I will be uploading my reactions to the entire Q&A as a separate video, but that's not going to be edited or like a discussion. It's just going to be my stream, basically, if you want to look at that. So I wanted to focus on this part because I thought this was particularly alarming, how much that they sort of seem to be ignoring what everyone says is the actual indicator of skill, and they believe they've identified the correct thing. But let's just go over the main argument that he makes, at least in this first section. He says, like, there's a common misconception that because MMR is based on kills and escapes, it is ignoring the skill of players. This is false.
But there's a common misconception that by using just kills and escapes to adjust your MMR, it's ignoring skill in the game. This isn't the truth, though. This is false.
The first thing that rubbed me wrong about this is the way he goes ignoring. Like, he's saying it's not actually ignoring it, you idiots. Like, it actually is taking that into account. So he's saying ignoring, like, you know, ironically. It's not actually ignoring it. But literally the last stream they just did, he just said...
It goes, I know that you died. It's ignoring how you got there because there's too much nuance to be able to make a real effective system. So we just ignore that.
So he just said, non-jokingly, it is ignoring how you died because there's too much nuance for it to be a very effective system. And then today, they were just saying that there's a misconception that, you know, it's ineffective at determining skill. This is false. He's just immediately contradicting himself, but that's beside the point. So they are very much of the opinion that because kills have a correlation to skill, and I can agree with that. Typically, if you kill more people than you don't, the correlation is there that you're probably better. Doesn't mean you are better, but probably you are better, maybe. But that doesn't really determine skill. And then he brought up this terrible analogy involving hockey, and I'll just let him say it.
Think about sports, and I'll use hockey as an example because I'm Canadian. You wouldn't say they only count wins when placing teams in the standings, but they should also count shots on goal too. A more skilled player takes more shots. And while that's certainly true, it's important to remember that shots lead to goals, which lead to wins. So you can kind of cut the middleman out there. And that's the key, right? Skilled play leads to wins.
So this analogy is based on the false premise that you are playing and being rated MMR-wise as a team. According to the data miners, and even when they talked about MMR the last time, we know that's not how it's being done. We know it's a 1v1v1v1v1 kind of thing. They've admitted that's how it works. So his comparison of a hockey team does not apply to an MMR system where you are still individually rated. By his own logic, if you are the guy that's taking 8,000 slap shots at the goal and, you know, you're getting a shit ton of goals, you are now as good as somebody that is on the bench because you're on the same team. Your team is still winning. Therefore, the guy on the bench who has done nothing is definitely as good as this guy who did everything. And that's actually a direct one-to-one comparison because you can literally be on the bench as a survivor. You can do nothing and still get an escape. And the guy that ran the killer for 6 hours, he is now... You're now as good as him because you were just on the same team as someone that did better than you. That's the main flaw in his argument. It's a giant, glaring flaw because that is not how their system works. The system is based on individual survivor ratings, not your overall team rating. And if they ever change it to an overall team rating, I'm not sure how that would work because they calculate MMR as soon as the game is done and for an individual player. They would have to calculate it after the match is over, which means your MMR would be adjusted after the match, after a delay for it to calculate all that, which I feel like they're not going to do that. But if they do that, I mean, that'd be great, but I feel like they're not going to actually do that. But that whole analogy makes no sense because there's no planet on which the guy that's sitting on the bench is as good as the guy that is getting all these goals. If they're playing on the same team, it doesn't mean they're as good as each other. And I think that's the main flaw with their whole line of thinking. And they have this whole, like, Seymour Skinner meme. It's not me that's wrong, it's everybody else. It's the children who are wrong. Everybody, like, on the planet agrees that it's not really a good indicator of skill. What would be a good indicator of skill is something like tracking the amount of hooks that you get. Now, obviously, there are certain exceptions, like if an Oni 4K slugs everybody, it doesn't necessarily mean the Oni is bad. However, it does also mean that he didn't really have much opposition to begin with. There's pretty much no scenario where a good Oni can down a full good team and have that be like considered an impressive play, because there's no scenario in which good survivors should let themselves even get into that scenario. So at that point, it's basically just beating up babies. So it doesn't really end up still indicating much of anything. When you get a bunch of hooks, that is what actually indicates, at the very least, a somewhat more than getting kills in terms of skill. But they specifically are against that.
Don't make sense when you take it to its extremes. Say you're a killer who hooked every survivor twice, but none of them died. If you count those hooks towards your rating, then you can easily end up in a situation where that scenario counts as a win, like moves you up the standings, but that feels weird. Did you really win? Should your rating go up and make you face stronger opponents, even though all of the survivors got out alive? Probably not, right? That's like an obvious moment of like, it doesn't really compute. It also doesn't make sense for the survivors. If you call that a killer win, that would mean the survivors lost, but they all got out alive. So that feels weird to call that a loss on the survivor side, unless you start saying that everybody in that situation wins. And then as soon as you can have everybody in a game winning, you get some really weird math, some really crazy stuff starts happening.
One of the problems I think that they have is they have this inability to understand what a draw is. Patrick brings up like, okay, so we have to go by kills, because what if a guy gets 8 hooks and doesn't kill anybody? You know, he shouldn't be rewarded for that. And I think everybody on the planet agrees, no, that is actually pretty impressive. In fact, that's far more impressive than getting 2 kills and just 6 hook states, because you've hooked 2 people and that's it. That's all you did. So by his own logic, someone that spreads out pressure, is getting in multiple chases and gets 8 total hooks, is worse than a Bubba that face camps one guy, face camps another guy, then the game ends. That's basically what they're admitting, which makes obviously no sense at all. So they really should be using hooks as a better indicator. It's almost like he's thinking about this in the complete opposite direction. It seems just so misguided to me, because it's the opposite of what you should be saying. He should be saying this argument for hooks and not kills, because kills do not tell the whole picture. Hooks don't tell the whole picture, but it's a better picture. If you have 8 or 9 hooks, you know that there was a lot of back and forth in that game. You know something happened. If there's 2 hooks, you don't know if it was 2 Bubba face camps or actually a bunch of hooks. Like you have no idea of telling that just from that information. So that's why pretty much everyone agrees you should be basing the skill correlation on hooks instead. But here's the interesting part about all of this, and something I even learned today while watching this. So I've given suggestions before on how to have a better MMR system, and we can make better suggestions. It should be based on hook stage. It should be based on hooks in total. It should take into account chases and all this stuff. I've learned something today. None of that matters. It does not matter how perfect your system is, because according to Patrick, their actual matchmaking system is very good at identifying whether or not a game is going to result in a win or a loss. The problem, he said, comes from the fact that the matchmaking can't allocate the resources to make that match happen, because at the high level queue times would just be infinite. Basically like what we had on the very first test when you had Dowsy queuing for 2 hours as the twins. So obviously that's not a thing that can happen. So they have to widen the queues more and more, to the point where it doesn't matter how perfect their MMR system is if the matchmaking doesn't follow the system. They can have the most accurate Google AI technology skill analyzing thing. They can be the most perfect thing ever made, and it won't matter if you're not matching up the numbers to begin with. And as they've self-admitted, they're not matching up the numbers because they're prioritizing queue times, which I will say from a consumer standpoint and a financial business standpoint is the smarter play. People would rather play an unbalanced game than no game whatsoever. If you're in queue for 2 hours, who gives a shit? Like, you're just never going to play the game. So it's interesting because there's no solution. He keeps talking about a solution to this problem. The only solution to this problem is bringing a ton of killer players back. That's the only way you fix this. Because if you have, way too many survivors and not enough killers, you will always have imbalanced matches that just disregards the system entirely. And the only way to fix that is if you have the correct ratio of players that enables that system to accurately matchmake people in a decent amount of time. So, unfortunately, with how the game seems to be heading, that's not the case. So unless they bring killers back, this is not even an MMR issue anymore, I've realized. This actually has nothing to do with MMR. It has everything to do with the fact that there's simply not enough killer players, which I suppose must be true, because that's the only reason survivor queues would be getting longer and longer. And it's interesting because I've noticed, and a lot of other people I know, like Tofu, noticed this too. When the MMR system first came out, we noticed we were getting actually consistently better players. Like it was actually an accurate system, and our queue times weren't that bad. So we were like, oh shit, maybe this is actually kind of working a bit. But then over time, it got worse, and I figured out why. It's because killer MMR was much easier to raise. The data miners found that there were way more killers at high MMR than survivors when the system first came out, which indicates that killer MMR was much higher to get to the top of, and survivor MMR is much harder to get there. So it actually was able to more quickly find matches because there were really not that many survivors in the upper brackets for killer. So there wasn't as big of a pool to choose from. But now over time, since there's no resetting of MMR, everyone has eventually risen to that soft cap to the point where we're basically just back at the old rank 1 matchmaking again. It's the same shit now. And now there's too many players in that pool again, and that's why the queues have gotten so much worse. So it may have been a placebo before. I thought there weren't that many killers quitting the game like when the system first came out, because my queue times, like the queue times were still like actually not instant for killer. But it's actually because of the imbalance of MMR. Survivor took too long to get there. And now as that's leveled out, now we're in a scenario where there's just too many survivors at the soft cap again. And basically just everyone just at the fucking soft cap of MMR, and there's just too many people to choose from. So the only way to fix that is either to change the cap, which will probably make queue time significantly worse, or to simply have more killer players so the matchmaking can be more effective. So this is sort of moved away from an MMR argument, and it's now a simple ratio imbalance argument. And I think this is the case because they actually asked them what the actual ratio for killer to survivors are right now. And he was like Neo. There was like question. He was just dodging it. He answered everything but the actual question. He said, we can't tell you because it changes too much. It changes too much. They didn't want to, they could have just given you an average. If it changes a bunch, it doesn't matter. You give the average, and that's the number we want to see. They didn't tell us that average because I will have to admit, it has to be because there's just not enough killers. That's the only way to explain the extremely long survivor queue times. It just makes too much sense. So that is the reason why this whole system is broken, and why I think they should just remove MMR. They never should have done it to begin with, because this was bound to happen. I think because of the imbalance in the player base, this was always bound to happen, and that's why they should just remove it. So it's interesting that I learned that this is not so much an MMR issue, because they actually said they think their system is working great. It's just the matchmaking that doesn't put people in the correct areas, but it can't do that because queue times would just take forever. So they basically put themselves in an impossible to win scenario where the only solution is to magically generate a shit ton more killer players or remove the system. That's it. So yeah, this whole Q&A was literally nothing. I went and counted how many things they actually answered or said yes to. It was one thing. They said yes to one thing. Everything else was no, or we don't know, or it's too soon to tell. I don't even know why they do it. Why do they do these to begin with? Like, I appreciate them being open. I really do. I've wanted that for a while. I want them to be open with Q&As, and I want them to, be open what they're doing. But they're not being open. They're just saying, maybe we're doing it, possibly in the future. I don't know. So they're not really being open. They're just saying basically nothing, which is as good as not having a Q&A to begin with. So that's it. Yeah, that was just underwhelming and depressing. Elden Ring in a month, though. That's cool.